The city skyline, usually a glittering tapestry of ambition, felt particularly oppressive that morning, a steel and glass cage pressing in on the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, distorting the view of the financial district into a watercolor blur. Protagonist preferred the sterile quiet of his lab, the focused intensity of microscopic examination. But a call from the detective rarely allowed for preferences. Protagonist sat at the polished obsidian table, a stark contrast to the rough concrete slabs of his usual domain. Around him, the tension was a palpable, suffocating entity. The detective. A man whose face was perpetually etched with the weight of the city's grim underbelly, leaned forward, his elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the holographic display at its center. Across from him, the victim's corporate counsel, a woman with a severe bob and an even more severe expression, clutched a leather portfolio as if it were a shield. A security chief, burly and tight-lipped, stood sentinel by the door, his gaze sweeping the room with professional paranoia. The detective, there in his impenetrable smart home. He gestured to the display, which now showed a series of high-resolution images. The first was an aerial shot of a futuristic residence, all sharp angles and glass, perched atop a cliff overlooking the ocean. Finch had been a titan in the tech world, a visionary who'd built an empire on digital security and AI. The irony wasn't lost on him. The subsequent images were more graphic, more immediate. A lavish living room, dominated by minimalist art and automated systems. The detective Finch, sprawled on a plush rug, his eyes wide and vacant, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his silk dressing gown. Initial reports indicate manual strangulation, the dead detective there truggle. Significant dysarthria. The display flickered to a close-up of Finch's neck, lividity already setting in, the telltale bruising of fingers. His gaze drifted over the details, absorbing them, cataloging them, even through the flat plane of a digital image. The subtle angle of his head, the way his left hand was curled, not quite fisted, not quite open. The scattered papers, an overturned ceramic vase, a broken lamp, standard signs of a violent confrontation. The primary suspect, detective stated, his tone leaving no room for doubt, is his estranged son, detective. He was found on the premises, disoriented, with a fresh laceration to his forehead and blood on his clothes. Finch had disinherited him last year. A very public, very acrimonious split. The corporate counsel cleared her throat, her voice tight. The detective she has always been. Volatile. This is hardly surprising. Protagonist remained silent, his mind sifting through the visual data. The narrative was tidy, almost too tidy. Estranged son, history of conflict, found at the scene, physical evidence of a struggle. It painted a clear picture for any jury. Most would have closed the book already. But his work rarely dealt in clear pictures, only in the messy, often contradictory details. Protagonist focused on Finch's body again, zooming in on a specific detail on the display. The bruising on his neck was deep, consistent with a powerful grip. But the pattern. Protagonist mentally mapped the contours, the pressure points. It was firm, yes, but almost too uniform. He claims he doesn't remember anything after an argument with his father earlier that evening. Blacked out. And the laceration? A fall, he claims, after the blackout. Detective shrugged, dismissing the explanation. He's in custody, being processed. We are waiting on the full forensic sweep, of course, but everything points to him. I leaned back, steepled my fingers, my gaze still fixed the screen. The disarray in the room was indeed significant, but it felt staged. The broken lamp, for instance. Its shade was crumpled, the bulb shattered, but the base sat upright, almost perfectly centered on its small side table. A struggle of that ferocity should have toppled it completely. And the papers scattered the rug. They seemed to have fallen in neat separate piles, not flung haphazardly. The detective? The detective epted theachin, they're a defensive posture. And it's not the clenching of a struggle either, more like a residual tension, as if he was holding something or trying to. The detective detectivand. Are you there was H detective thereupon? No, I clarified. More like he was reaching for something. The muscle contraction, the way the fingers are set. It's not what I'd expect from someone fighting for their life, or even someone who just succumbed to an assault. The corporate counsel scoffed, a soft, dismissive sound. He was strangled. People react differently under duress. They do, I conceded, my eyes still the screen. But patterns emerge. But beneath it, almost imperceptible, was something else. Or perhaps, recognition. It's a minor anomaly. The DT detective detective, carefully modulated there. And in case, detective the dev theorist, most overlooked details. My internal alarm bells, faint but persistent, had Betherange Sun was the obvious answer. But beneath it, there was a stillness, a peculiar resignation that didn't quite align with the raw, primal fear etched into his features. It was a detail, a whisper in the cacophony of evidence that snagged at my peripheral vision. I closed the image, the screen fading to black. The detective sea of a colleague, sharp and impatient, cut the hum of the equipment. Detective I straightened, pushing away from the console. Always, I replied, my voice steady, betraying none of the subtle unease that had settled in my gut. Just reviewing the preliminary visuals. The scene shifted, not physically, but in the compressed reality of a high-stakes investigation. I found myself seated at the polished obsidian the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. The room's panoramic windows overlooking a city that theared with indifferent brilliance. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken pressure. A large display screen dominated one wall, currently showing a split feed. A grim-faced detective from the city's major crimes unit on one side, and a technical analyst, younger and twitchier, the other. My colleagues, a forensic entomologist and a ballistics expert, sat to my left and right, their expressions ranging from focused to overtly frustrated. We're moving to the initial findings regarding the suspect profile. The detective, his voice crackling slightly through the speaker. He was a man I'd worked with before. Efficient, by the book, and prone to latching onto the most obvious solution with the tenacity of a pit bull. As you know, Finch's smart home security was layers of biometric locks, motion sensors, reinforcer emitters. We've been through the external logs, the internal network, everything. There's no sign of forced entry, no digital breach from the outside. The system was never truly compromised, not in the way we usually see. The technical analyst nodded vigorously, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple. Theron diagnostics on every firewall, every server. Whoever got in, they didn't hack their way through. They walked in. A heavy silence descended, broken only by the hum of the boardroom's ventilation system. The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Which brings us to the detective, his gaze sweeping across virtual faces, the screen, settling briefly on mine. We've got a long history of animosity between them. Public arguments, a recent attempt by the detective report merger, a rumored disinheritance clause in the father's will set to activate next month. He paused, letting the information sink in. And then there's the physical evidence these screens shifted, displaying a series of high-resolution images. The first was a close-up of a shattered ceramic vase, its fragments scattered across a Persian rug. Found this in the main living area. The detective Dia Ivor preliminary analysis shows a partial print on one of the larger shards. Matches the Deathy's left thumb. My gaze remained fixed, the image. A print on a broken vase. Not unexpected if there had been a struggle or even just a presence. It was a piece, but not the whole puzzle. Next, a slide showing microscopic fibers. They're a blend of cotton and synthetic, consistent with the fabric from a jacket the detective found detective earring earlier that day. Another image appeared, this one a still from a security camera feed, showing the detective in detectively rumpled jacket entering a different building hours before the incident. It pointed to direct physical contact, a struggle. It aligned perfectly with a strangulation. And finally, the detective voice resonating with conviction. We have DNA. Preliminary rapid DNA analysis points directly to the detective etch. The technical analyst chimed in. And regarding the security, Finch had a backdoor access code, an old one he'd used for years before the system was upgraded to biometric only. It was phased out, but not fully purged from the system's memory. It could have been reactivated, or even known by someone intimately familiar with She's habits. A backdoor access code. Old, known by the sun. The motive, the means, the opportunity. A perfect, airtight case, already being constructed with the speed and precision of a well-oiled machine. My colleagues around the table were nodding, satisfied. The entomologist murmured something about accelerated decomposition. Ratatha ballistics expert just grunted, seemingly relieved not to have to analyze projectile trajectories. The detective like he was already writing the arrest warrant in his head. I, however, found myself staring at the split screen, at the detective's confident face, and then at the technical analyst's anxious one. The evidence was compelling, undeniably so. It implicated the Finch detective that would be difficult to refute. But the stillness on She's face, that peculiar resignation, still nagged at me. The lack of defensive wounds I'd noted earlier, the almost too clean nature of the scene, despite the apparent struggle. It was all too perfect. A crime scene that screamed sun from every angle, yet whispered something else in the quiet corners of my mind. It was a feeling I'd learned to trust over the years. A subtle discord in an otherwise harmonious narrative. And it was a feeling I couldn't leak. The entomologist's low murmur about accelera faded into the hum of the air condition, the sound that usually offered a strange command the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. Today, it merely underscored the growing discord in my own thoughts. The faces around the polished table, reflecting the sithets through the panoramic windows, were alight with a grim satisfaction. The narrative was already solidifying, hardening into an unassailable truth in their minds. But my mind, unfortunately, rarely played along with convenience. Not the typical friction marks from a struggle, or restraints for that matter. More like a series of minute parallel striations, almost crystalline in their precision. A colleague, a senior investigator with a perpetually furrowed brow, cleared his throat. We are still considering the possibility of defensive wounds, the detective. Or perhaps Detective F, a struggle against a smooth, hard surface. The preliminary reports covered that. I saw the preliminary reports, Protagonist countered, his gaze sweeping across the table, eating the eyes of the forensic anal striglective and the chide tectivations in turn. But the depth and consistency of those striations, they didn't match the general chaos of a struggle. They were too uniform, too deliberate. A species of ephedra sinica. A few eyebrows rose. Ephedra sinica was not a common plant in this region, certainly not in a meticulously maintained urban penthouse. Struggle-search shrub, often found in arid, rocky landscapes and historically used in traditional remedies. You mean the herbal stimulant? The forensic analyst asked, a flicker of ain curiosity in her eyes. Surely that's just wasn't eminent. His social media, his financial records, his smart device location data all confirm it. He hasn't left the city. The East Hariv was beginning to fray at the edges. It's a very low count, the detective. The chief detective said, his voice measured, almost placating. Could be transferred from anywhere. A faint, almost imperfect initial tests suggest a complex polymer, not something readily available in consumer product detective thief, wasn't corrosive. It was inert, but stubbornly present. The initial certainty was slowly giving way to a nascent unease, The detective scratched high-detective paint a picture that deviates significantly from the neat, obvious conclusion involving the son and a simple, Iwasik family dispute. My internal thoughts raced. The son's backdoor code provided access, yes. But did it provide the precision? The elaborate nature these subtle anomalies hinted at? A phantom killer, I'd thought earlier. The idea was still embryonic, barely formed. But these disparate details were beginning to coalesce around it, giving it form and substance. The simple narrative felt too simple, too convenient. Not just the reports, not just the photographs. I need to be hands-on. The chief of investigations hesitated, then nodded slowly. Very well, the detective. But remember detectives ticking on this. We have a solid case already. And I have a professional obligation to ensure it's the right case, my determination hardening with each step towards the boardroom door. The easy answers were often the wrong ones. And these subtle anomalies, these tiny, discordant notes in the symphony of evidence, were singing a different tune entirely. Dissonant, disturbing melody that I couldn't ignore. I pushed through the heavy oak door, stepping into the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. The air thelled with a sterile chill, a stark contrast to the humid afternoon outside. A vast, polished mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. On one side, several large monitors glowed, display a dizzying array of data streams, network schematics, and code. Huddled over a laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard, was the there heard to there not there in concentration. And if you're looking for external breach attempts, you won't find any. This system is a fortress. We had run every protocol, cross-referenced every access point. No unauthorized entries, no brute force attacks, no malware signatures. It's clean. She gestured to a screen displaying a green, unblemished timeline. Every sensor, every camera, every lock reported nominal function throughout the critical window. It's air-gapped from the public internet, too. A truly closed system, as advertised. Protagonist leaned over the table, his gaze sweeping across the glowing displays. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming. A digital tapestry woven with 1,000,000 threads of information. The surface, her assessment sounded bulletproof. It was exactly what the initial reports had claimed. An impenetrable smart home. And what about internal activity? Protagonist aced, his voice calm, betraying none of the doubt churning within. Any unusual commands issued from within the network? Temperature adjustment washing changes, even the automated coffee brewing. All authenticated. The thermal sensors are integrated with the fire suppression system. Any significant temperature spike, let alone localized combustion, would trigger an immediate alert and log it. Perfectly flat line for the entire residence. It also doesn't match anything found in the home's inventory, according to the inventory logs I reviewed. She scoffed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Dr. Maxwell, the system is designed to be tamper-proof. Every chemical dispenser, every appliance, every utility is monthly. If a foreign substance was introduced, it would be flagged. If a sensor failed, it would report a malfunction. There are no malfunctions. She leaned back, crossing her arms, a clear signal of her unwavering certainty. The digital footprint is crystal clear. The system was never breached, never manipulated. It operated flawlessly. Then the flaw isn't in the system's operation, Protagonist countered, his voice low but firm. It's in what the system doesn't log, or what it's been made to not log. The physical evidence tells a different story. Those burns, that residue, they didn't materialize the thin air. There's a discrepancy between your data and my observations, and I trust my observations. Protagonist stepped closer to the screen, displaying the environmental logs. Let's look deeper. Not just for external breaches, but for internal blind spots. For specific sensor overrides that might not register as a breach because they were executed with what the system thought was legitimate authority. I need a granular breakdown of every single command, every sensor reading, every micro-adjustment, time-stamped to the millisecond, not just summarized. Her confidence wavered, replaced by a glint of professional curiosity. She knew the reputation of the system. She also tattooed the implications of a forensic pathologist's thetans. That would be an incredibly resource-intensive and time-consuming process, her voice less dismissive now. We are talking about petabytes of raw data, not just aggregated logs. Then start digging, aiding to the environmental control section. Focus the period immediately preceding and during the estimated time of death. Specifically, look for any command, however brief, however subtle, that could have temporarily dithed or spoofed the thermal sensors or the smoke detectors, or any anomalous energy draw that doesn't correspond to a logged device. She sighed, a reluctant agreement in the sound. Her fingers began to dance across the keyboard again, but this time, her movements were slower, more deliberate, as she delved into the deep architecture of the smart home's operate thestum. The screens flickered, displaying increasingly complex layers other and data. Minutes stretched, punctuated only by the soft click of her keys and the hum of the machines. Then, as the sharp intake of breath from her. "What is it?" Leaning forward, my heart quickening. She pointed to a minuscule entry, buried deep within a subdirectory, a time-stamped sequence barely a fraction of a second long. Here, so brief, it was almost purged by the system's own self-optimizing algorithms. To temporarily depressurize the localized fire suppression system's main valve, and simultaneously, to recalibrate the thermal sensor array in Zone 3 Thaving Room to a passive monitoring State 4. It wouldn't have registered as a breach. It was a command issued from within the system, with full administrator privileges, but it was deleted from the primary log just milliseconds after Theon. Only the raw, uncompiled kernel data retained it. My gaze locked onto the glowini of code. Long enough to do something devastating, something precise. Some twashat would leave physical evidence but no obvious digital trace for a casual review. Was impenetrable aspect of the smart home wasn't Katabayan external, there it was exploited from the inside, like a meticulously placed inthe. The Phantom Killer wasn't just precise. They were intimately familiar with the system's architecture, its blind spots, its very DNA. The glowing line of code, imprinted in his mind, still buzzed behind his eyes as Protagonist sat in the penthouse boardroom Dwasan emergency call. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, the unspoken accusation that hung over the absent the detective. Outside, the city shimmered under a pale detective ed inside. The mood was anything but bright. The lead detective, a man whose thence Protagonist knew, wore the anything that strayed from the pent, Therpalit Theris further v emergency call through a tablet, occasionally glancing up with an expression that mixed awe and apprehension. They wantherative, a smoking gun. There fit that narrative perfectly. There's voice cut through the stare and arrest warrant ready. The detective's alibi is the digital footprint points directly to his. There do you need? Protagonist leaned forward, resting his elbows, the cool surface. Protagonists need to understand how impenetrable became exploited. That line of code, the specific vulnerability in the smart them, it wasn't just a random hack. Detective the knowledge, yes, but also a specific intent. The system wasn't cracked by an external force. It was exploited from within its own architecture. The detective scoffed. He built some of it, didn't he? Knows the detective than anyone. Perhaps, I conceded. But the exec that it's too clean. And it doesn't quite align with the physical evidence I found during the initial examination. I want to re-interview the detective, I stated, my voice firm. I want to press detective G's, the sways of events he claims. We've already been over his alibi, sir. He was at a bar across town, then went back to his own apartment. The system tage from the bar is patchy, but the timestamps mostly check Theosly isn't good enough, I countered. And patchy is a red flag in itself, isn't it? I need to know precisely how patchy and if there are any gaps. Even a few minutes could be enough. This wasn't a prolonged attack. The detective sighed, running a hand over his tired face. But this is our lay detective who don't get anything concrete. We move forward with the warrant. It took another hour, filled with tense phone calls and the rustle of paperwork, before the detective was brought back into the boardroom. He walked in flanked by Detective Unsel, his face pale but composed, a defiant glint in his eyes. He sat opposite me, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond Mither. "The detective," I began, my voice even. "We need to go over your movements, detective detail, from the moment you left your apartment yesterday evening that you returned." He recounted his alibi, word for word, exactly as he had before. The bar, the drinks, the rideshare home. He maintained his innocence with a practiced calm that was almost unnerving. "And the time between leaving the bar and arriving at your apartment?" I pressed. "The rideshare logs show a delay. An unexpected detour?" The detective hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features. "Detective Day-Night. The driver took a longer route." He offered a casual shrug, but his eyes dow the corporate counsel, who gave a subtle nod. "A longer route where, exactly?" I pushed, ignoring the counsel's glare. "Did you make any stops? Did you Spetheon during that time?" He shook his head. "I was listening to music. Did I pay much attention to the route? It was a small inconsistency, easily explained that it gnawed at me. The lack of spa-was detail, the slight defensiveness. He wasn't outright lying, but he wasn't entirely forthcoming either." Then, the corporate counsel interjected, clearing her throat. "Go on." "There was a recent acquisition," the Kuth explained, her voice stare-dadicked. "The founder, a man named Marcus the Detective, was publicly humiliated. This was too neat, too convenient. A disgdetwasloyee, a corporate rival, a classic diversion. It was plausible, certainly, and it offered a clear external motive, unlike the murky family tensions. The detective's eyes, previously narrowed with suspicion at the detective, now widened with other interest. The detective detectiving a note. "Do we have an address?" A detective G, the shift in focus, relaxed visibly, a faint, almost impure detective playing on his lips. He had weathered the storm, and now a new target had been presented. If detective was her ness, the way he latched onto this fresh lead. It was a path of least resistance, a simpler explanation than the intricate web of digital exploitation I was beginning to unravel. But for now, the investigation had a new direction, pulling us further away from the precise, almost invisible hand that I suspected they'll detective thee to follow, even as every in the rear being led astray. The high-backed leather as felt too plush, the polished mahogany table too grand for the grim subject at hand. I sat in the penthouse boardroom during an M-Wazy call, the panoramic city lights outside offering a stark contrast to the darkness coalescing around the case. My own F-the-Ref printouts clutched in my hand, a deeper dive into the initial autopsy report and the subtle anomalies I'd flagged. The detector leaf from the previous interactions still gnawed at me. The detect eagerness to pursue a new, easier path felt like a betrayal of the truth. I the shack the fee the hat we were being led, our assumptions carefully manipulated. It wasn't just a simple case. Penthouse therited on a deeper analysis, their henition to run the there-or sensitive May emergency call specifically targeting trace organic compounds that might have been overlooked. My gut had screamed that Sothie was off. A whisper of a foreign agent that there was, hidden in plain sight. A spectral peak that therein signature, almost identical to a naturally Okayan their ifrant. Its presence in such minute quantities expultharist, why it hadn't caused immediate overt symptoms. It was a slow-acting neurotoxin, designed to mimic a sudden cardiac event, but with a specificity connecting the dots. But there you did it. Now, with this synthetic analog, the window snapped shut. The compound waste have killed instantly. It would have induced a gradual systemic shutdown, culminating in heart failure at a predictable interval after administration. Protagonist looked up, meeting the detective's impatient stare. "The time of death," Protagonist stated. His voice cut through the hushed ruses, "not what we thought. Not broad, not easily swayed by external factors. Down to the minute." A colleague, a forensic analyst, shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. The detective. The initial findings were clear, and the surveillance footage places the detective sightings during the broader window. The broader window is a red her there rivist countered, tapping the chromatograph. This compound, a synthetic new voice, it's designed to induce the cardiac arrest. In minute quantities, yes, but enough to be let the precise dosage. Protagonist paused, letting the information sink in. And its half-life, its absorption rate, its metabolic pathway. They all point to a specific administration time. Not within the detective's earlier visit, not even close to the last time he could have plausibly been in Kothi. The detective's eyebrows furrowed. "Are you saying the detective didn't do it?" Detective saying the detective couldn't have done it. Not in detective is killer operated. Protagonist Clary Detective C firm. The smart home's records are irrefutable. The detective left the residence at 2:17 a.m. The easy narrative, the estranged son, the other motive. It was unraveling before their eyes. This neurotoxin, it's not something you'd find in a kitchen cabinet or a garden shed, Protagonist continued, pressing his advantage. It requires specialized detectives, a size, precise dosage to administer, and a detailed understanding of human physiology to detectives, theft and timing. It's not voices kill. It's a calculated, almost theatrical execution. The detective leaned forward, his earlier eagerness replaced by a grim fascination. They wanted a detective rative. The delayed action of the toxin, the meticulous setup to a natural cause, the timing to implicate the detective yet leave just enough ambiguity for a deeper dive. It's all part of a grand design. Par detectived up another printout, this one detailing the unique cellular degradation patterns. This neurotoxin doesn't just stop the heart. It causes a very specific subtle form of cellular breakdown. It's why the initial cause of death seemed so straightforward, yet felt off to him. It was designed to look simple, to misdirect. The killer is intelligent, meticulous, and has a deep understanding of forensic science. The implications hung heavy in the air. The game had just changed. The easy answer vanished, replaced by a far more elaborate and sinister plot. The tension in the room, already thick, became almost suffocating. His determination hardened. We were no longer hunting a frustrated son, but a ghost. And this ghost was a master of misdirection. The hum of the air conditioning in the penthouse room during an emergency call did little to dissipate the tension. The city sprawled beneath, wasanoramic windows, oblivious to the intricate web of deception Protagonist had just laid. Protagonist stood at the head of the polished obsidian table, the purther beaming his findings onto a retractable screen. The detective's face etched with a mix of frustration and grudging respect, leaned forward, his gaze detective sensation. A small group of other investigators, their initial skepticism replaced by a grim acceptance, occupied the him. The initial theory of the estranged son as the killer, Protagonist Bethea's voice steady despite the weight of his words, was a carefully penthouse bothered entry. No digital footprints of a hack that after a gruntled family member could excetherex a slide, displaying a comp emergency calm. This wasn't brute force. It suggests a profound understanding of network architecture and embedded systems, beyond what we typically in a criminal enterprise, that they sink in. Furthermore, the toxin we identified, a Savoy's Eurotoxin, fast there, is not available. The open market. Its molecular structure points to an very clandestine one. This wasn't a simple poisoner. This was someone with actheremical agents. And the staging, pressing another button. The subtle shifts in furniture, the specific item left out, a vintage watch-thee nightstand which the son there to bed. These were not random. They were calculated misdirections, designed to point blame, to solidify a narrative. This is not the work of an amateur. This is the hallmark of someone trained in psychological manipulation, in operational security, in creating a ghost in the machine. The detective exhaled slowly, the sound loud in the quiet room. "So, what are you saying? The detective?" "Protagonist detective," I met his gaze, "that we're dealing with a phantom. Someone with a unique detective-ite. A blend of advanced engineering, high-level chemistry, and perhaps even espionage training. This isn't a lone wolf with a grudge. This is a professional, operating with resources and precision that suggest a network, possibly an organization. An individual with this combination of expertise isn't accidental, not just a simple exploit. It's like they built a parallel wreath inside the system, a shadow operating system that report their thing as normal while the actual event una. That takes serious 8-level resources, or someone who's spent a lifetime dedicated to bypassing high-security protocols. Exactly, I affirmed. His findings point to a similar level of sophistication. It's custom-tailored for rapid incapacitation and near-undetectable lethality. This isn't something you learn from a textbook. This is practical application, likely from a field where such agents are weaponized. The detective slammed a hand lightly, the table, the sound sharp. "So we're looking for an engineer who's also a chemist detective. Someone who can walk through walls and leave no trace." His voice held a new edge, no longer just frustrate systeming realization of the scale of the threat. "Where do we even begin tech for thee like that?" "We start by looking for the impossible," I responded, my mind already sifting through the data. Individuals this specific high-level combination of skills are rare. They often come from specialized backgrounds, intelligence agencies, black ops contractors, perhaps even rogue elements from advanced research institutions. We need to cross-reference known individuals with these profiles, focusing on those who have gone off-grid or voice Ebian associations with clandestine operations. Another investigator, a profiler, chimed in. The level of planning, the sheer audacity of framing the sun so meticulously. It speaks to a deep understanding of human psychology, but also an almost artistic detachment. Who would benefit from such a meticulously orchestrated crime beyond the obvious finality? The question hung in the air, pulling us deeper into a labyrinth of possibilities. The detective rose, his movements deliberate. "All right. The detective's findings have given us a new direction. This phantom kill detectivist in the machine isn't going to vanish. Cyber forensics, intelligence analysts, toxicology labs, everything. Focus on individuals with dual-use expertise, especially those with ties to classified projects or black market networks dealing in advanced tech or chemical agents. This isn't a local incident anymore. This is something far more dangerous." As the others began to mobilize, making calls, accessing databases, I felt a shift in the thagation. The path ahead was obscured, leading into a dangerous, clandestine world where the rules were unwritten and the stakes were impossibly high. But for Air's time, I felt like we were finally theg in the right direction. The game had truly changed. The air in the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call, pent boardroom, during Zeonam de Mechaloises and the persistent glow of the monitors. I stood by the expansive window, not admiring the city lights that stretched the horizon, but feeling the vast, indifferent expanse of it, and the chilling thought that somewhere within that sprawl, a predator moved, unseen. The detective paced, his movements tight and economical, while the cyber analyst hunched over a bank of screens, fingers flying across a keyboard, a steady stream of code scrolling like arcane glyphs. "We've been chasing the detective," the lead AV stated, not looking at a projected image of the detective's meticulously yet ultimately violated study. "Detective's the sun, a scorned heir, a simple act of ray air you kept pushing, Didn't Detective did penthouse board? Rutherreap, the glittering facade of corporate pa. The anomalies were too pertherition, the thanius damage, the almost surgical F-Thorel itself. It was prothes. But more than that, emergency called self the nth end, rather than the end itself. A low beep drew our attention to the cyber analyst. The detective ran a parallel network. Entirely separate directive globbed their read days to even find the entry point, another day to crack the encryption detective sieve. Tethected itheremp detective, hematics, financial ledgers, and communication logs, all bearing a recurring code name. Protheral most clinical. My eyes scanned the data, see the familiar patterns, for the fingerprints of the killer their detective they've theed, stepping closer to the... What is it? It's not a product, Detective Thalist replied, his voice strained with the effort of explanation. I was global, decentralized their network. Encrypted beyond anything commercially available. It bypasses all existing surveillance, all traditional data infrastructure. This wasn't just a corporate secret. It was a paradigm shift. The detective wasn't merely a tech mogul. He was building a new world order, or at least the infrastructure for one. This wasn't about a new smartphone or a faster processor. This was about detectation control, or absolute freedom, depending on who wielded it. He wasn't just developing it, I interjected, step theorizing, connecting dots I hadn't thought existed until this moment. He was implevoicit. The Theanspheres, the satellite uplinks, the secure data caches. This wasn't a research project, or close to it. The lead detective's eyes, usually sharp and deigning, widened with a dawning comprehension. So, the motive isn't about his son or his company's stock. Project Chrysalis. Someone wanted it, the cyber analyst confirmed, scrolling through more data. Or they wanted to prevent it from ever seeing the light of day. The Wasnications here? They show the detective was under immense pressure. Threats raised at first, then increasingly direct. He was refusing to relinquish control. His mind flashed back to the crime scene, to the detective-specific, almost ritualistic arrangement of certain items in the study. The precise nature of the fatal blow, not just efficient, but almost symbolic. And then, a detail clicked into place, fatal anomaly there inconsequential during the initial examination. The faint, almost invisible residue Protagonist had found beneath the D, there's fingernails, initially attributed to a struggle, now took on a terrifying new meaning. It was a microscopic trace of a specific polymer, one Protagonist had only seen in highly specialized miniature electronics. The thief searching for something, or ensuring something was removed. Protagonist found traces of a unique polymer, almost crystalline, under the detective's right thumbnail. Too minute to register as a struggle injury, but it wasn't from the environment. It was from something he was handling, something that perhaps trying to conceal or even destroy just before he died. The cyber froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. There's Detective Zari for a biometric key, a physical token designed to activate and coa the primary Chrysalis server, made of a polymer alloy, extremely durable, almost invisible to standard scans. He zoomed in on a section of the blueprint. The IMA clearly showed the distionyl-lecture of the polymer Pathology had identified. The pieces were finally falling into place. Was Detective's ARPRT espionage, global power plays, a ruthlessly efficient killer. The meticulousness wasn't just for cover, it was to find or retrieve that key. The Phantom Killer wasn't after revenge. They were after control of a network that could rewrite the rules of struggle. This changes everything, the lead detective stated, his voice low, heavy with the detectives we waste just hunting a kill was more. We're hunting an organization or anthe powerful enough to want this and capable of taking that active the detective out of the picture with such precision. This is their a murder investigation, the detective. This ether of... The easy answers were long gone. Now we faced a foe driven by an agenda detective. The detective's life was merely a pawn in a much larger, far more detective. The frigid air of the penthouse boardroom during an emergency call did penthouse boardroom add that stuttering. The Deathian life detective, Ecalere sacrifice, a single theoved in a game far grandera more malicious than any of us had theli conceived. The scope of its stretcher was before voice aerifying abyss, and Protagonist felt the weight of that realization pressing down, a physical ache beneath. The room itself was a study in stark corporate power. Polished obsidian surfaces reflected the city lights far below, making the high-rise feel like a detached island in a sea of urban sprawl. A colossal screen dominated one wall, currently displaying a complex web of data points, network schematics, and the familiar blueprints of She's smart home. Around the gleaming elliptical table, the faces were grim. The lead detective, his jaw tight, the tech analyst, pale Anachi, hunched over a tablet, and the legal counsel for Finch's company, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper suit, her expression a careful blend of concern and calculation. "All right, detective," the lead detective said, his voice cutting through a detective get again. "Iang, you've got penthouse boardroom eutherites." Protagonist pushed back from the table, his fingers tracing the edge of Detective Theotasia, the way the smart home system was bypassed. They're an incredibly soft-theted, highly coordinated Thesian, then emergency callger, but a group driven by agenda. I gestured towards the screen. We established that the system theact in the conventional sense. It was manipulated from within, using vulnerabilities that only someone with intimate knowledge of She's bespoke architecture would assess, and in thereto the specific hardware or software porthi that allowed them to essentially become the system itself. Their A-Team's deep devoice Finch's company network revealed something disturbing. A series theli encrypted data packets, originating there designed to mimic internal communications. Therabing the system, mapping its defenses, not for weeks, but for months. It was Therion's. He was the verge of unveiling a new proprietor-lechen protocol, a true quantum leap in data security. Something that would have rendered existing methods obsolete overnight. Something immensely valuable and immensely disruptive. I paused, letting the implicta sink in. This isn't about revenge. Control of the foot detective, the individuals involved aren't just Telied detective strategically ruthless. They needed Finch out of the way. And they needed his system comways to extract the core schematics of his new PAR system entire setup of the smart home. Voicey random bypasses, the false flag implicating his son. It was all a lead detective, for the real objective. Inthual property theft on an unprecedented scale. The lead detective slammed his fist lightly the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "So, we're talking about system espionage, maybe a rival tech conglomerate. We have a motive, the detective, a damn good one. But here's the problem. We still don't have the smoking gun. We can't put anyone in that penthouse. We have no physical point of entry, no Digwa signature that screams intruder from outside system twerk, no specific device that directly links to Thigh Detective P." He was right. We had identified who and why, but the crucial how remained elusive. The genius of the operation was its seam nuus. The perpetrators had left no fingerprints, no forced locks, no obvious digital breadcrumbs leading directly Theo them from the crime scene itself. It's like they materialized out of thin air. His gaze drifted back to the enlarged blueprint of Finch's penthouse screen, the intricate layers of security, the redundant systems, the almost paranoid level of efficiency. It was designed to be a fortress, yet it had been Brewa's not by force, but by finesse. About the anomalies, detective, Protagonist pressed, his mind racing through every detail Protagonist had cataloged. The minute inconsistencies, the subtle shift in air pressure recorded by one of the environmental sensors, just for a few seconds, that was delayed as a glitch. The microscopic particulate matter I found, the ventilation grate, the main living area, so fine it almost blended with the natural dust. The tech analyst looked up, his brows furrowed. We flagged that air pressure dip. It was so mythalmost within the acceptable variance. We wussed it was environmental. Construction dust from a nearby site, maybe. But it wasn't, Protagonist countered, the pieces starting to click into place with a sudden, electrifying clarity. The spectral analysis of that particulate showed trace elements inconsistent with typical urban dust. And that air pre-sleed detective wasn't a glitch? What if it was a momentary compromise in the penthouse's hermetic seal? A very brief, controlled depressurization, followed by an immediate repressurization. His eyes darted for screeners the faces around the table, a surge of adrenaline sharpening his focus. The smart home wasn't just impenetrable, it was designed to be self-sustaining. Its air filtration, its climtherol, its entos, all isolated. To thee anything or anyone into that environment without triggering an alarm would require a complete, albeit temporary, bypass of its environmental controls. And the only way to do that without leaving a digital trace in the main security logs would be to exploit a physical. Analog. Vulnerability. To AI-fix section of the blueprint, a rarely accessed utility shaft was vertically through the building. DESA for maintenance access ways penthouses independent the core. That shaft. It's shielded, sealed, but it still has a service the accessible from the penthouse level, behind a reinforced panel. A port that would penthoused, if narrow, conduit to the outer or to the building's main utility network. The lead detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You are saying they was maintenance to introduce something or someone into the penthouse environment without tripping the main sensors. Per Protagonist affirmed, a fierce determination hardening his resolve. And that's where we find our smoking gun. Not in the digital ether, but in the physical woe-screen aciulate matter, the air pressure anomaly. They're not random. They're residual evidence of a highly specialized infiltration D, the something designed to enter that shaft, bypass the thenal seals, and deliver whatever towed to neutralize she and compromise his system. The hunt for that one crucial physical piece of evidence had begun. The sthethium of the air did little to cut through the oppressive tension hanging in the penthouse boardroom during anthocall. Fluorescent house of the boardroom, glinting in the during of the assembled persona detective, his face emergency-called of frustration and grim determination, watched me expectantly, along with a few other colleagues. The hunt for that one cruciphesical piece of evidence had begun, and now it felt like it was ending, one way or another, right here. My gaze was fixed on a minute detail, one I'd dismissed weeks ago as an artifact, a fan detective faint, almost theoretical ripple in the internal environmental sensor data, logged precisely at the time of the CEO's demise. I'd seen it, flagged it, then may lead chasing more TAL traces. But the recent intelligence regarding our new suspect, their known expertise in sub-miniature electronics and Clancy system bypasses, had dragged that blip back from the periphery of my mind. Look at this, I stated, my voice cutting through the quiet. I tapped a stare against the screen, zooming in further on a specific section of the data stream. It was an anomaly in the ambientology field readings, a transient spike barely above background noise, astered by Mutha sensors. To I thought there was a data cortha, or alkalized power surge. The smart home's own diagnostics dislead detective legible varier. The detective leaned forward, his elbows, the table, studied intently now. Now, I continue the mind racing, connecting disparate threads. I believe it's a signature. It was a composite image, built for penthouse boardroom light, there to highlight imperfections. See this? I pointed to a hairline fracture, almost invisible thinning wash and a milli there the panel. We categorized it as a manufacturing defect. Harmless. But their colleague wheezed, his voice low. No, I confirmed, feeling the piece's clemergency calls an almost audible theel snap. And it aligns perfectly with the energy spike. Our suspect is known for developing micro-infiltration devices, tools capable of creating their most imperceptible structural weakness using highly focused energy bursts, allowing for erasive access to sever even physical space. They're eculative, yet it resonated with the unsettling precision of the Phantom Killer. The CEO's impenetrable smart home wasn't Breakwa's force, nor by tradeth their almost screen manipulation of its own infrastructure. The killer didn't enter a door or window. They crew their own temporary invisible portal, to the reaving only the faint echo of their passage in the energy logs and a minuscule thrust fracture. The device, I elaborated, my voice gaining momentum, with their high-frequency energy pulse, momentarily weakening the molecules in the material. Just enough to allow a tiny Aoikaro bore to pass through their seal itself, leaving behind only that faint stress fracture and the energy signature, the one that their post-mortem analysis. Exactly. A highly volatile, fast-acting agent, delivered directly into the system, designed to dissipate rapidly, leaving behind only the physiological effects of a heart attack that's why the initial findings were so misleading. The sun's DNA doorknob was a plant, a misdirection. The room was silent, the weight of the re-weather resting down on us. The Phantom Killer wasn't a ghost. They were a master of stealth and precision engineering. "So, what now, the detective?" the detective asked, his voice sharp with renewed thee. "How do we find this device? How do we find them?" "We look for the source of that technology," I said. Darrow faced the room. "They wouldn't abandon a tool like that. It's a signature. And that energy spike, that frathy, they are the definitive link. That's the proof." A flurry of activity erupted. Orders were barked in detective was already pulling up satellite imagery and schematics for the suspect's known Pathology. The hunt was no longer for abstract evidence, but for a physical location, a tangible piece of technology. Within minutes, an address was the screen, a discreet, unmarked warehouse, the city's entheisted under a shell corporation. Auspec's known private research facility. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead we had. Now, we had Tall on it. I grabbed my coat. "Let's go. That device, that evidence, it's there. And if it's there, the killer might The drive to the industrial warehouse district was a blur of flashing lights and urgent radio transmissions. The tension in the vehicle was palpable, a coiled spring ready to release. We brevoice heavy, reinforced doors, move-in system weapons drawn, into a labyrinth of machinery and experimental tech. And to Toimli lit corner, hunched ovinitial cluttered with microcircuitry, was the suspect. Their heads snapped up, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and resignation as the beam of a tactical flashlight pinned them. The bench, glinting under the sudden illumination, was a sleek metallic device, no larger than a fountain pen, with a tiny, almost invisible bore at its tip. The apprehension was swift, silent, punctuated only by the click of restraints. As the Susawas led away, their gaze met mine for a fleeting moment. The Phantom Killer had been given a face, and the elaborate, sinister plot hathily unraveled. The door gave way with a splintering groan, not the clean breach we'd anticipated, a violent tear in the metal frame. Alarms shrieked, a raw, piercing sound that detective they eardrums. We poured into the cavernous space. Tactical lights the ethereal gloom, revealing stacks of unidentifiable machine screenwazers and the faint waslick tang of ozone. "Clear!" A shouted command echoed from the front of Themation. I moved with the second wave, my eyes scanning, not for threats in the immediate sense, but for the telltale signs of a carefully constructed lair. The hum I outside waiter here, a low thrum beneath the concrete floor, emanating from a cluster of server racks glowing with an eerie blue light in there. This wasn't at a hideout. It was an operational hub, asn't running, wasn't fighting. He stood by a console, fingers poised over a keyboard, illuminated by the harsh blue glow. A thin man, impeccably dressed even in this desolate environment, his face devoid of surprise, almost serene. He looked up as the lead tactical acer approached, a faint, almost imperky smile playing on his lips. "It seems you've caught him." His voice calm, almost conversational, there surrounding him. Though Protagonist there took you rather longer than Protagonist anticipated. The lead tactical officer, though with practiced efficiency, securing him. As they cuffed him, his gaze flickered past the officer, meeting mine. There was a knowing Glythe's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the intricate dance we'd performed. He was the phantom, the architect of a flawless illusion, and I, the one who had seen The drive back was less a blur and more a slow unraveling of tension. The radio chat he is still urgent carried notes of success, of closure. The arrest was made, the immediate threat contained. But the questions, the deeper, more unsettling questions, still hung ether. This wasn't just about a murder. It was about the meticulous crafting of a lie. Hours later, the sun already dipping below the urban sprawl, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I found myself in a penthouse boardroom during an emergency call. The room was opulent. A stark contrast to the grimy boardroom mahogany gleamed oasis-essed during ceramic windows offered a dizzying anthe-city the detective voice inside recalled, eventually. A collective sigh rippled through the room. Protagonist remainant, watching, listening, piecing together the final mosaic. His motive, the detective continued, was a twisted form o theorate justice. He believed the detective Maxwell was a corrupt visionary, someone who had built an empire backs of stolen innovations and broken promises. He saw himself as an avenging angel, using Maxwell's detective Jai against him to expose the rot within. The Priya, almost surgical insertion plead the specific neurotoxin. The way the smart home security logs had been subtly rewritten, not erased, detective to point directly at the sun's access codes. The security architectives bypassed Twastum. He had become the system. Dr. Maxwell's fine their instrumental, detective leadaged, turning to me. The specific type of neurotoxin, the methylthelivery, the Priya staging of the scene. It all contradicted the initial, simpler narrative. The security architect had designed the perfect murder, an impenetrable fortress turned into a tomb by its own master. He had crafted a narrative of an angry son. A tragic accident wasn't of Passio, that he had underestimated the stubborn persistence of truth, etched in the minutiae. A PD detective, operating not with a way air but with lines of code, manipulating the very fabric of modern life. It was a new frontier of malevolence, a precision that was both terrifying and, in its twisted way, brilliant. As the meeting dispersed, a colleague approached him, offering a weary smile, theme for a books, the detective. Protagonist heed, feeling the weight of the day of the past weeks settle upon him. The city lights outside there with a new, sharper edge. The quiet hum of the building around him, a distant echo of the warehouse's server farm, reminded him that Earl of such intric-thestums, then to be exploited, waiting to be understood. His work was fatherly honest, felt a renewed sense of purpose, a quoth determination to con detective it of the subtermergency call poke volumes. The was initial system knew there ether there.